Today we're going to talk about things you shouldn't do when writing business emails in English. We've just published a blog on this subject, so if you work in English, go and read the new blog as it gives great tips and pieces of advice on how you can improve your business email writing skills. I want to speak about 3 pieces of advice in the blog. The first one is on how you greet people in an email. So when you learn English, you're taught to start an email or a letter with "Dear" and then the person's name. So let's imagine you're writing to a Mrs. Beyonce Carter. You'd maybe start your email with "Dear Mrs. Carter." "Dear Beyonce" would also work, but it's slightly less formal. Now, that's good, and you can continue using "dear." However, it is worth noting that people are leaning more and more towards less formal ways of communicating in the workspace. So you'll see "hi" a lot more. So starting an email with "Hi Beyonce" is also acceptable. If you do decide to start with "hi," it's best to follow with the person's first name. "Hey" is a little bit too informal, so we'd advise you not to use it. The second piece of advice is to avoid using vague subject lines. So when writing business emails in English, it's very important you summarize the point of your email in your subject line. So avoid using subject lines like "quick question" or "urgent" written in capital letters. These don't tell your recipient what your email is about, and you make your email difficult to locate should they need to refer back to it. If, for example, you're writing with a question about a new contract you're working on, include the contract name and the main question in your subject line. If you're writing about a fire drill happening on Thursday, then make your subject line "fire drill planned for Thursday." Basically, make your subject lines precise so that your recipient knows what they'll be reading about. And the third piece of advice from the blog that I want to talk about is this: avoid, at all costs, sending angry emails. This is less of an English language point, but is useful for anyone writing business emails in any language. Now, of course, colleagues will make you angry from time to time, but writing an angry email won't do anything to help the situation. So here's some advice. Write the email if you must, and then delete it. Use writing as therapy, but don't send your colleagues what you have written. I sometimes take a step away from my desk and go and make myself a cup of tea or go for a walk. It gives me time to clear my head and gain perspective on the situation. Then, once I feel calmer, I can come back to my computer and write an email that is a lot more level-headed. A calm sounding email will be a lot more effective in moving a project forward than an angry sounding one. We've covered a lot of other points in our new blog post on things you shouldn't do when writing business emails in English. So make sure you go and have a read of it, especially if you use English in your workspace. Enjoy reading the blog and see you on the podcast in our next episode. Bye!
Have you ever thought seriously about living abroad? Not just going travelling on holiday for a few weeks, but actually picking up your life and moving it to another country. Most people probably haven't considered it very seriously. Like most living creatures, we humans are in many ways best suited or adapted to the environments we live in. We know how things work in our own countries, right? We know the systems, the laws, the customs, and most usefully, the language. By this stage, I think I've lived and worked outside the UK for most of my life. On the whole, I feel very lucky to have had the chance to experience life in different countries. some of them very, very different to my own country of origin. The realization that there are lots of ways to organize human society, all with their own strengths and weaknesses in different areas, is really fascinating. But it can also bring with it a lot of difficulties and new problems to solve on a daily basis. When I found myself a long way from home and struggling with some aspect of life that the people around me, comfortable in their own environment, all seem to be having no problems at all with, there's a game I like to play, a kind of thought experiment. I try to think backwards in time and imagine how much harder it must have been to live abroad in the past. Let's take something like keeping in contact with your family as an example. The first step is to go back before the days of Wi-Fi and smartphones, when you had to queue in an internet cafe for a dial-up connection, which would cut out every time you got halfway through typing out an email. Further back, before the internet, speaking to family meant finding a payphone and having to collect coins. Go back even further, and all you had was writing letters. There was a delay of weeks between each letter, between questions and answers. And how about going back to the times before aeroplanes existed? Letters had to go by sea and would have taken weeks. Not to mention the fact that getting home in an emergency would have taken weeks too. Yes, living abroad was a decision not to be taken lightly in the past. We've got it easy nowadays in comparison. The internet and modern technology has changed things completely and opened the world up in ways that couldn't have been imagined just a few generations ago. One of the things that has revolutionized life the most for me in recent years is instant translation apps. Coming from a country with an alphabet-based language to a country like Japan, where the writing system is character-based, I've really struggled with reading. In most European countries, even if I didn't know much of the language, I'd at least be able to identify separate words and pronounce them after learning a few basic rules. That's a big first step in learning a new word. But in Japan, I could be looking at the same road sign or shop window for years, and if I don't know the kanji or characters it's written in, I'd probably never get any closer to being able to read or pronounce it out loud. That's been really challenging and has made lots of areas of life difficult for me. For example, filling out application forms online, doing complex transactions at ATMs, and the list goes on and on. But since Google Translate became available on smartphones, that problem has, well, not gone away completely, but has been made much easier. Translation apps used to be pretty bad at translating Japanese to English, probably because they used to be rule-based. They were taught from grammatical and linguistic rules. And, for example, Japanese and English are so different that the translations rarely made much sense at all. But more recently, with AI technology that uses massive databases of text in each language to find the best translation it can, the quality and accuracy has improved dramatically. And with Google now building in its Google Lens image recognition technology, which can convert image to text, you literally just have to point your phone's camera at the sign, computer screen, ATM screen, or whatever it is you need to translate, and you can get an almost instantaneous translation. Now, how good is that? Well, it certainly doesn't remove the incentive to learn the language and its writing system properly, but it does remove an awful lot of pain from day-to-day life. You could even take a screenshot of the audio script of this podcast and upload it to Google Translate and check any words I'm using that you're not familiar with. Anyway, back to living abroad. I went for a walk on Sunday to a place in central Tokyo that is famous for its ginkgo trees. At any other time of year, you don't really notice these trees, but right now they're at the peak of their autumn colours. In November, the leaves turn bright yellow, and as they fall off, they cover the street like a yellow carpet. It's a pretty amazing sight, and presumably that's why several thousand other people had all had the same idea. For someone like me, who enjoys spending time alone, and even needs to be alone from time to recharge my batteries, being in a huge crowd is not a great feeling. But somehow this weekend I didn't mind it too much. On this occasion, I actually enjoyed the sight of so many people enjoying themselves, and all making the most of this temporary splash of colour in the big city. And it really is a special sight. I might have to get used to large crowds though, given the news that came out this week. In case you missed it, the United Nations announced that the number of people living in the world today reached 8 billion for the first time. For those of you preparing for an IELTS exam, or if you just enjoy finding ways to make your English a bit more concise, another way of saying that is that the global population just crossed the 8 billion mark. Global means that it relates to the whole world, and population means the people living in a place. So the global population is the total number of people living on planet Earth. And that's what I want to talk about this week. The study of populations is called demographics. It's a big subject, and it looks at statistics in all sorts of areas related to people and populations. Not just numbers of people, but also things like gender issues, environmental issues, poverty and inequality. But one interesting question that Toshiko Kaneda and Carl Haub have been trying to answer, two demographics experts at an organisation called the Population Reference Bureau, is the total number of humans who have ever lived. This is not an easy question to answer, as there's no demographic data at all for about 99% of human history. But to keep things simple, I'll just tell you their findings. They estimate that the total number of humans who ever lived on the Earth is approximately 117 billion. That's a lot of people, but get ready for this. About half of those 117 billion humans lived within the last 2,000 years. Considering that our species, Homo sapiens, is thought to have existed for around 200,000 years, that should give you some idea of the rate of population growth in recent times. And if you're good at maths, you'll have already done the calculation and figured out that if there are 8 billion of us today, and a total of 117 billion of us throughout history, that means that 7% of the humans who ever lived are alive right now. Amazing. But before the introverts among us begin panicking and imagining crowded streets everywhere we go, I should point out that predictions for the future are a little different. It seems the global population is going to continue growing, but at a slightly slower rate. It's only taken 11 years for us to go from 7 billion to 8 billion. But demographics experts at the UN predict that we'll see the global population increase by another 2 billion over the next 35 years or so. But then things will probably plateau. Let me explain that word. A plateau is an area of flat ground at high altitude. The largest, highest and most famous plateau in the world is the Tibetan Plateau in Central Asia, but they exist all over the world. So, if you imagine a graph that rises steeply and then levels out into a flat line at the top, well, we call that a plateau too. So the global population will likely plateau at around 10 billion. That's not so surprising, really, considering that a lot of countries in the world are experiencing population decline nowadays. There are a lot of demographic reasons for this, and those of you living in Japan, South Korea, and a lot of European countries will probably know all about this. But that's a story for another time. So, my question to you this week is, what do you think about global population growth? Should we be worried about it, or should we be more worried about population decline?